Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the K-Stream Podcast. This is episode 15, I believe. I am Jeff Kozlowski, and I'm so excited about today's guest because I think we're changing lanes a little bit from what we usually talk about on here, from live streaming and video to the podcasting world. Our guest, I think through a mutual following on Twitter, some of her content and the company she runs caught my attention. So I'm so excited to have Jaclyn Schiff on the podcast. She's the CEO of PodReacher. Jaclyn, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Jeff. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research and checked out your website and saw that I think you have a journalism background, and I love talking to others with a journalism background. I went to undergrad and got a master's in journalism, had all intentions of going into broadcasting and or something like that, and ended up in the marketing world and doing stuff like this, and I love it. So I always like to see kind of where other aspiring journalists kind of the direction they took their careers. So can you just talk a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. It is interesting, right, to see how many of us trained journalists end up in different kind of walks of content, I guess is kind of the broad term that we call it. But yeah, so right out of college, I'd worked in journalism for a couple of years in the DC area, and I saw that you're there as well. Was mostly working in healthcare journalism, global health. So this pandemic has been a very interesting thing to kind of observe from the sidelines and just with my background there. But, I think I came into journalism at a really interesting time. Social media was disrupting things. And changing the industry. And I think Anne, who was coming up at the same time I was really thinking, is there a future in this field for me? People were getting cut left and right from newspapers. And so I thought for, where I wanted to be, I thought it made sense to try different things. And maybe I could bring my knowledge and understanding of reporting to other stuff. And so kind of went back and forth between journalism and what I would say is, communications or marketing for a couple of years, and eventually struck out on my own. So this is at the end of 2016. I'd been working at a B2B healthcare publication in Chicago, and just decided it was, I'd been freelance before and decided it was, time to be independent again. And I spent about 2 years, doing like various different kinds of freelance work. And if I had to put a name on all of it, I would say everything kind of fell into the category of content strategy. I gravitate towards storytelling. That's what drove me to become a journalist. And I find it interesting, how do you bring people in and engage them with the written word? I think that's a question that I've always at the core been fascinated by. And after 2 years of freelancing, I guess I should back up a bit, but I've always been an avid podcast listener. I think I'm an auditory learner, so I absorb information really well that way. And, I like to say that I was listening to This American Life before it was easy to get it on your smartphone, right? Because it used to be a whole process, and now it's just, click, click, and you can listen. So with that in mind, I'd always kept an eye on the podcasting space. And at this point, we're in 2017, so Serial has come along, and that was a big hit. And podcasting is just exploding. And I was sort of looking at what some podcasts were doing from a marketing angle, because, I think to this day, people say that podcasting has a discovery problem. I'm not sure that's exactly right anymore. I think that when people say that, they're expressing a sentiment of I don't want to market, or marketing is really hard, which it is. But in looking at this, I realized that some of the podcasts that were doing really well, getting to the top of the iTunes charts, Apple charts now. Were doing a lot of repurposing. They didn't just see themselves as a podcast in one channel. They weren't just audio. They were doing text. They were doing social, video. All these things. At the same time, I also noticed on Upwork that a bunch of people had asked this. They wanted to turn podcast episodes into articles. And so, which essentially is journalism, right? Because it's typically an interview. And what you do when you create an article is you interview a source and you extract the most important things for the people that are going to be reading it, and you organize it in a way that is appropriate for the audience and the publication. And so I did a few of these projects and saw that there was increasing demand for a service like this. And essentially PodReacher has grown from there. And that was just over 2 years ago now.
That's awesome. So, and first, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far.
Thank you.
So talk about the importance of all of that. So kind of getting the most bang for your buck when it comes to podcasting. I have since starting my own, you really start to see quickly, like, it is hard to do it all by yourself. Like, it is, I love the video aspect of things. So this part of like live streaming it, and maybe then after it's over, taking some of those video clips and sharing them on social or my website, like that's something I enjoy doing. But, right. That's such a great point of gosh, you're talking to such interesting subject matter experts on your podcast, and I'm sure you want to get as much shelf life out of those things as you can, right?
I mean, I think that's an advantage of doing it right. I think a lot of people that are making a podcast feel like, how can I get more from this episode? Because you hit publish, you promote. And especially if your podcast is evergreen, which means that the content is relevant, it's still going to be relevant like 2 months from when you publish, how can you keep getting that message in front of an audience that wants to and needs to hear it? So I think that's, a good reason to repurpose content. I think I went off on a tangent from your original question, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to doing that. But as you point out also, just simply making a podcast each week, or, whenever you're making an episode, there's a lot that goes into that. And then, repurposing it from there, I mean, that in and of itself is a lot of work as well.
Yeah. So tell me, so your company is called PodReacher, and I know, if you go to the website, it talks about turning podcasts into blogs. So if I am, if I were seeking your help and I wanted to take my episodes and turn them into blog posts, what does the process kind of look like on my end? And then what are you guys doing?
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So, and obviously also, I think important to point out that there are various different types of repurposing. So there's, taking the audio and turning them into audiograms or video clips, stuff that's appropriate for social media. And we actually don't do any of that. So we really stick with, and I'd say our core competency is taking the spoken word and turning it into text. And I actually don't love the word repurposing because it's sort of, I feel like it devalues, I think this is an art, and I think there's a process to doing it well. So I like to say what we do is we optimize audio content for text. And so when we work with a podcaster, we'll always do the first episode, turn the first episode into an article kind of as a test. We want to make sure that we can do your content justice. And we want to also make sure we want to give you, an opportunity to try it out. So the entry point for most podcasters is we have like a special offer, and it's just $75. And what we do is we have a writer who's matched with your podcast based on the subject matter, because it's it's always, you always want someone who has a little bit of familiarity, because the key to doing this well, the key to taking audio and turning it into text well, is in getting at the nuance, and really understanding the audience and what they need from it. So we are always trying to match the writer with a podcast that they've either written about, or at least have the ability to learn and get really deep into the weeds on who the audience is and what they need to know. They'll listen to your full episode, and then working from a transcript. So like a question we get a lot is this transcription? Yeah. And it's not, right? Like, so we're always working from a transcript, but then the process is to really organize and structure it, again, with that audience in mind. What is the useful information from this episode that a person's going to want to read? And so they'll write a draft. We then have an editor who reviews it and is, again, thinking about, with a very audience first mentality. We're thinking about SEO, and that's really important. But I don't think SEO is the beginning and end of written content. I think it's possible to create really good, valuable content that, considers and wants to be found in search, but that isn't only to be found in search engines. There's a lot of different ways that people use content. So it goes through editing, to answer your question, and then it's given over to the client. And, we pride ourselves on being a service that we turn things over to our clients, copy and paste ready. To your point, podcasting is really time consuming. And there's so much that goes into producing, packaging, and then promoting an episode. And this is something that can add a lot of value on top of it, but people don't have time to do it. So we're typically turning it then over to, a marketer for a company who's making a podcast, or the content person for that team. And then they basically go and publish the article. And there's different ways that they publish it. But that's not a part of the process that we're involved in. So we're really just sticking to the content and making it as good as we can.
That's awesome. And if you have writers that you kind of assign based on subject matter, do you then, you must have quite a few, or at least, I don't know if it's freelancers or what, but quite a few people you can tap for this work.
Yeah. So at this point, the writing team, we have about 25 writers, wow. And we're always, looking for more, because again, we want people with different, different skill sets, and different subject matter backgrounds. So the writing team is about 25. Everyone's a contractor, and the editing team, including myself, is there's 4 of us that review the content.
Okay. And I think I saw, in doing a little bit of research before this episode, it may have been a LinkedIn post or something. You also talked, you've in that post in particular, you talked about the importance of show notes. Regardless if it's part of what PodReacher does or not, talk about, and if it is, talk about that. But I also want to talk about the importance of show notes, because, I know personally, what I do, or what I've done is, I'll write a brief description of the episode, maybe who the guest is, what we talked about, list out relevant links, maybe, where any equipment they mentioned, or, my website, their website, if they wrote a book, I'll link to that. What should we be doing in show notes, and talk about the importance of those?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And originally we actually didn't do show notes. So it is a service that we offer now. And again, so it's 2 services. We either turn an episode into a blog post, or we create show notes. And the reason I didn't want to do it at first is it feels, when people outsource show notes, it feels a little bit like a race to the bottom. You want to find someone on Fiverr, the cheapest provider possible. And I wasn't sure there was really an opportunity there. But the more I spoke to people in the industry, I talked to people that run like smaller podcast production companies, and marketing agencies that focus on podcasts, and they were really good at making a podcast and the production process, but then when it came to the show notes, because they're not constantly managing writers, that piece sometimes fell short or the quality was inconsistent. So where we come in with show notes is for that kind of podcaster, right? Like, it's really important that your quality be consistent and really good. We're often working with more technical kind of subject matter. So we do like a lot of legal, a lot of finance podcasts, sort of very in the weeds with different areas of tech. And it requires a bit of a more experienced show notes writer than, just the run-of-the-mill person that you might get on Fiverr. And I find show notes very interesting because I think they are, like kind of the neglected part of podcasting. Again, it's like you put all the effort into an episode, and then it's like this afterthought. It's like, oh, I need something that says what this is about. Yeah. And I think one of the advantages of outsourcing it, even, it doesn't have to be with us, right? Just outsourcing it, is that you do have someone who's got like an open mind and the brain space to think, what is this about? How can I entice people to want to listen? I think of show notes as a resource for your current listeners. And I think this is, something that, again, like, people just aren't spending a whole lot of time on it. So I don't think it's like well thought out. But I think of it, again, as a resource for people who are listening. So it might be something that they reference after the show. They heard a tool or a website or a service or something, and then they want to go back to your podcast website, the episode page, and they want to say, what was that? And I'm always asking about this on Twitter, and I find the discussion very interesting because anytime I ask a question and I think I have a hunch of what the answer is, I get a million other answers. So I'm constantly surprised. For example, I asked, do people appreciate having timestamps in show notes? Like, how often are you referencing those? And obviously this is like a very informal poll, but like a number of people responded that they really liked it. And they sort of think of it like a table of contents for the episode. Mm-hmm. And it helps them, like, because sometimes episodes can be, as we know, especially for people that are like making a podcast as a side gig, or, it's not necessarily a professionally produced podcast, they can be long, and it helps them like go to the part of the episode where, which would be most relevant. So, that also got me thinking, wow, so should you be including timestamps in the description area? So when someone sees a podcast on their app, like, we've typically just included a summary that would entice you to want to listen to it. But maybe there's a place there for timestamps. And so we're often experimenting with format, but yeah, I guess that was a lot, but I think that speaks to some of your question.
No, it does. And definitely the importance of it. And how important are show notes when it comes to, so you mentioned the importance for your current listeners. Are they as important for, discovery? Like, if people are searching for a show, I mean, how much does show notes play a role there?
So I'm really glad that you brought me back to that, because this is a point that I wanted to make. I think a lot of people think that show notes can work for discovery, but I've looked into this a lot and spoken to every SEO person that I revere and learn from, and a show notes page is not going to rank right now. So that's in the typical like when I search Google on my laptop and whatever, it's very hard. And I don't think there are any show notes pages that are ranking. One of the reasons is there's usually just not enough meaningful text on a show notes page. You're putting up a summary that's 250, 300 words. And even if you're doing keyword research or whatever, it's hard for something like that to do well. Podcast SEO, so getting your podcast more visibility within the various podcasting apps, that's a separate topic, and I think is emerging and really interesting. It's something I'm paying close attention to, but this is why I say I think of show notes as a resource for your current audience, is because I don't think it's an entry point for people to learn about your podcast. If you want to focus on that, the better bet is to be turning episodes into blog content, because then people will find you through Google search.
That's awesome. And yeah, that, you've totally made me kind of rethink how I go about the show notes. And it's kind of, I think of it how I watch some YouTube videos. If I was sitting down watching a full-length YouTube video, like you said, I love I've watched lots of like long form videos, long form interviews, and I love that if they have in the show notes, I can click to the time code, to the topic I want to listen to. If they mention equipment in the show, I love that I can, if they list that out and I can go purchase it myself or take a look at it, how much it costs. So that's interesting. Making me think I need to think of my podcast show notes more like I would, maybe for a YouTube video or something. Like it's that important. In a lot of ways, I feel like, and I've read that a lot of folks think, podcasts are kind of in their infancy, and there's so much more to come for podcasting, and you're starting to see more videos, podcasts being turned into video, or video podcasting, live streaming podcasting, and services like yours, so like turning your podcast episodes into longer form articles or written articles. What's next for podcasting, or you mentioned some things you kind of have your eye on. What else do you have your eye on when it comes to podcasting?
Yeah. And I agree. I mean, I think it's in its, I don't know if I'd say infancy. I think we're in the toddler years with podcasting. Maybe, but yeah, it's fairly young. I think as an industry, you are seeing, more signs towards maturation, certainly at least with the acquisitions that we've seen. And, with kind of now the, I guess, rivalry between Spotify and Apple. I'm definitely very interested in podcast SEO within podcast apps. There are two products that I've found that will help you, almost like an Ahrefs, but geared towards optimizing your keywords within an app. And so that's something I've just been experimenting with, and like trying to see what kinds of results we get. I wish I could remember the names of them, but I just it's escaping me. I could give them to you afterwards.
Yeah. Put them in the show notes.
There you go. So that's something I'm interested in. I also think, as podcasting matures and as there's more competition, it's interesting to see, the different kinds of formats that we're seeing. And, it forces, creators to push for innovation, right? Like, I think one of the things is there's a lot of long form interview shows, regardless of your industry, right? And so there's a lot of people doing the 45-minute or so interviews. And, I think what you've seen over the last year or so is that's pretty saturated. And so now people are being pushed to, here's an interview in 10 or 15 minutes, and, changing formats that way. So I think it's interesting. I think the competition also makes for better content. And like I said, more innovation in content, and that's an exciting thing to see.
Absolutely, and that you kind of made me think of another question here. Won't take up too much more of your time, um, but I know when I was starting my podcast, and I think I do mine at least right now because it's fun. I enjoy the subject matter. I'm not trying to turn into Joe Rogan at this point by any means, but obviously it's something to aspire to, I guess. But it is. There, I can get the feeling that the podcast world, some might be intimidated because it does feel like there are just so many podcasts and somewhat, I don't know if maybe saturated, but
Yeah.
is so what, if somebody is starting a podcast or struggling to get it noticed, what is something, and if it's something that we've already talked about, great. What is something that people can think of now to kind of level it up? Is it just thinking of something you can do to innovate? Is it writing, making sure you're creating written content as well? What can they do?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm gonna ask you a question if that's
Okay,
okay. But
please.
like, no, because a lot of people say that like there are too many podcasts or whatever. But um, like, would you feel the same way? Do you think if you were thinking of writing a book, like, would you feel
Mm.
like, oh, there's too many books, I'm not gonna write one?
That's a great point. And no, I don't think I would feel that.
No, and like it's interesting because whenever I make that point, you get a strange look, and people are like, "That's absurd!" Like, there's never too many books. But some for some reason, when it's a digital thing, because I think there was also this
Yeah.
question at some point with blogs, where people were like,
Yeah.
"Oh, should I start a blog?" No, there's too many. I think there's always room if you have something to say. And I would say that most people do, right? Because like even the way you're going to say something is going to be
Mhm.
different than how someone else is because you bring your life experience, your perspective. So I think if you have something to say and podcasting is your preferred medium, I think there's a way to say it. And I think part of the fun, right? And this is also like when people say, well, podcasting has a discovery problem. And I will grant that I think there could be better tools to help direct us to the the podcasts that would be better for us. But again, I'm going to bring in the example. I'm going to bring in an example from a different form of media. When I go to Netflix and it recommends stuff for me, it's I don't know if I can swear on this, but
Please. Yeah.
it's a crapshoot. Like no, like it's just, and do people say like Netflix is a discovery problem? They don't. So I think it's, to that point, it's all about the marketing. I
Yeah.
think good marketing always starts with like thinking really intently about what you're going to say and who you're saying it for. Like, how do you add value, right? And I think when you start from there and and your first episode, your 10th episode isn't going to be amazing, right? Because the more you do it, like the better you get at it. But I think if you at least are thoughtful and considerate and start from a place of really wanting to create good content that adds value, the rest is just about strategies and tactics, because there's an audience there that probably wants to hear it, and it's about how you find it. For certain people, yeah, turning it into a blog post, is going to help. Like, but I also say, and I'll be honest about this. Clients come to us and they say, how quickly is this going to help me grow or whatever, and I'm like, not very quickly. It's going to take a while. Like content marketing takes a while, because that's essentially what we're doing. We're creating a content marketing channel for your podcast. The first thing you should do, I always say, if you're focusing on download numbers and you want to see results, is get on other podcasts, get mentioned on other
Mhm.
podcasts, right? So stick within the channel. People are already listening. You're not asking them to do something that they're not doing. And it's a seamless experience. Once you're listening in an app, they can look up K-Stream and, easily subscribe.
Mhm.
Um, So that's the first place to go. But then the rest, there's no, if it was easy and if there was a formula for everyone, then everyone would do it. But, I think the challenge and the exciting thing is that you have to experiment. You got to try different things. You got to see what works. Because like, let's say you do a podcast for people who are really into a certain type of video game versus something like what you're doing, where you're talking about content and live streaming. Those people are going to be in really different places on the internet. Their podcast consumption habits are going to be really different. And so the question is, how do you reach them?
Well, Jaclyn, I've learned so much during this episode today. It's really been a pleasure. Before I let you go, is there anything else you want to mention? Maybe what's next for PodReacher, or anything we didn't touch on that you wanna convey to the audience?
No, thanks, Jeff. This is I always love doing this because it's fun. One of the things I love about podcasting is, at least for me, so like, day to day, I'm sort of like hands dirty in the business, thinking through like all these little things, and to take a step back and just talk about it and like think it through different eyes is it's such an awesome experience. And thank you for, creating this platform and making the time. I don't think so. I think we covered a lot. I think, one thing I would add is, so obviously I mentioned, we're typically working with businesses that are leveraging podcasting as a marketing channel. Increasingly what I would like to do is, and we have a free training on our website on the exact process that we use to turn episodes into blog posts. So if you go to podreacher.com, it's there. But, I recognize that this, not everyone can outsource this. And, like I said, I mean, I'm honest with clients. It doesn't make sense for everyone. But, one of the things to think about is, even if you don't repurpose content on a regular basis, once you've reached, 20, 25 episodes or something like that, a really relatively easy post to do is, to kind of do a list based on the insights that you learned from those initial episodes. Lists are great clickbait, for better or for worse. And then, you can link to each episode. So sometimes if people missed an episode, I think that's a great way to kind of celebrate and acknowledge your milestones as a podcaster and get more leverage from the content you've already created.
I love that. And I thought of one more thing. I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, like, do you have any podcast recommendations right now? What are you listening to? What are you loving? Anything I need to turn on after this episode?
Oh, that's funny. So I do like listen to a lot of like very like businessy and entrepreneurship podcasts, which isn't necessarily everyone's jam, but and I like to say, honestly, like, I mean, there was a period of time where I was considering going to business school and getting an MBA, and instead I listened to podcasts. So I didn't spend the money, didn't do it. And not to say there isn't a lot of value in that, but a podcast I've been enjoying lately actually is it's Sam Parr, the founder of The Hustle. He's got a podcast with a friend of his, and they're often like jamming on different business ideas. They recently did an episode where excuse me, my voice is cracking up.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. They recently did an episode. So I typically live in the Chicago area, and they were talking about, so Michael Jordan, he has a house there that has been up for sale for like years. Like, I'm not even kidding, like 10 years. And it hasn't been able to sell because it's like, it's this mansion, it's amazing, but it's like very like for Michael Jordan. So they were talking about like buying it and making it into a museum, which I thought was really cool and just a smart idea. And it's the kind of thing that they talk about. And I love podcasts that like give me other ideas. Not to say I would buy a house and turn it into a museum, but it just inspires your thinking.
Yes, I love that, kind of it's almost like listening to a brainstorming session. Me
Yeah.
being a video nerd to some extent, somebody I follow on Instagram the other day posted a question to their audience, and he's a videographer, video editor, and he said, would you guys watch a live stream of me like editing a project? And me thinking, I was like, oh my God, yeah, that sounds amazing. Like, but it's just you'd be sitting there watching somebody edit a video. But to me, that sounds so cool. So just, ideas are churning, I guess. But
Yep.
thank you so much, Jaclyn. I really appreciate the time. Best of luck to you moving forward with the company.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, Jeff. Thank you.
All right.